Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the second day of reunion and joining us for this very special event by our 50th reunion class of 1971. My name is Rona Wilk, class of 1991, and I'm the chair of the AABC Reunion Committee. We are also joined by Maya Jamanowitz and Julia Louie, class of 18, from the Office of Alumni Relations and Development, who are helping to make this event possible. As a quick reminder, little business, this online event enables an attendee to participate through a personal device's microphone and or camera. An attendee may elect not to participate through the use of a microphone and or camera, but the election of an attendee to use a microphone and or camera constitutes a release and waiver of rights in the capture of the attendee's image, likeness, and or voice for the exclusive use by Barnard College. And we are pleased, very pleased, to be joined by several members of the class of 1971, Catherine Brewster, Ruth Louie, Susan Metz, Lee Canosa, and Carla Spurlock Evans, all of whom have been instrumental in the organization BC Voices, Inc., which developed out of the Barnard Class of 1971's oral history collection, a substantial and representative collection of oral histories, and which aims to generate additional ways to share the experiences of women coming of age during the tumultuous political, social, and cultural upheaval of the late 1960s, early 1970s. And forging new paths for women during the last half of the 20th into the early 21st century. Today, they are here to focus on their docuseries, Stand Up, Speak Out, which tells the story of the radical transformation in women's lives, empowered by the mid-20th century expansion in women's rights and the hard-won freedom, independence, and opportunities that are still at risk today. Its goal is to increase awareness about what has been achieved and what could be lost. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the driving force behind BC Voices, Inc. and Stand Up, Speak Out, Catherine Brewster, class of 1971. Catherine Brewster holds an MBA from the Columbia University Graduate School of Business and has 50 plus years of experience in sales, marketing, management, and fundraising for businesses and arts organizations. She has been the president of BC Voices, Inc., a 501c3 formed by members of the Barnard Class of 1971 since its founding in 2012, and was executive producer of one of BC Voices' first documentaries, Making Choices, Forging Paths, and the current online docuseries, Stand Up, Speak Out, The Personal Politics of Women's Rights. And I do recommend you actually check out the Making Choices video, which I believe is still online. Catherine is also a recipient this year of the Award for Service to Barnard in recognition of the many ways that she has supported alumni and students over the years. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Brewster.
Thank you, Rona. Thank you for your support. And a big thank you to the All-Class Alumni Reunion Committee of the Alumni Association of Barnard College for making this film screening and discussion possible during Barnard 2021 Reunion Reimagined. And a welcome to you, our fellow Barnard alumni. We at BC Voices are thrilled to share with you episode 2 of Stand Up, Speak Out about voting rights. We thank you for your interest in exploring what voting rights mean in your life. So how did Stand Up, Speak Out, the personal politics of women's rights, come to be? In 2008, several alumni from the Barnard Class of 1971 gathered in a lobby on Barnard campus to share our stories and listen to one another about our varied experiences during the tumultuous spring of 1968, when our lives turned upside down as Columbia and Barnard students occupied buildings on the Columbia campus in protest against Columbia's involvement in chemical research for weapons used in the Vietnam War, and against Columbia building a gym in Morningside Park, a public park with an apartheid entrance for community residents. Barnard history professor Peter Juveler, an invited guest to our gathering, after listening said, "You really need to record and tell your stories. They are historically important." After much thought and discussion in 2010, the class of 1971, in preparation for our 40th reunion in 2011, began the process of gathering classmates' personal stories. We started with 17 oral histories in 2011, getting our feet wet, which formed the basis for a short documentary, The Way It Was, about the seismic changes in our lives from 1967 to 1971. And then agreeing we need a robust collection of life histories to capture the full diversity and variety of backgrounds and experiences among our classmates. In 2010, several of us formed a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation.
Hello! We're not on here.
You're muted, Catherine.
Since then, DC Voices Inc. has raised funds and created the Barnard Class of 1971 Oral History Collection, containing the life histories of 79 members of the class of 71. It is housed in the Barnard Archives and Special Collections and is a rich source of primary material for historians, researchers, and others interested in women's history and lives over the past 70 years. We've produced the short documentary that Rona mentioned, Making Choices, Forging Paths, and we are in the process of producing Stand Up, Speak Out, The Personal Politics of Women's Rights. It's a planned 6-episode online documentary series. So Stand Up, Speak Out illuminates what women's rights and their lack mean in women's lives over the past 200 plus years and today. And it highlights the voices of women who came of age in the 1968 era in conversation with their older and younger female relatives to reveal what changed, what's still the same, and how far we still have to go to realize women's full equality in American life. Episode 1 about equal pay for equal work illuminates women's ongoing fight for the recognition of the value of our labor. And today, we will be focusing on episode 2 about voting rights, the story of American women's fight for a voice in the laws and policies that affect our daily lives and the importance of the right to vote in our personal lives today. We start with a look at the 200 plus year arduous fight and today's ongoing challenges. Let's watch.
As millions of American women cast their ballot in 2020, they carry with them the peril, grit, and fortitude of thousands of outspoken foremothers who battled for voting rights. A century after women won the right to vote, the fight continues. Since the nation's founding, voting in America has met obstacles. In 1789, the year George Washington was elected president, under governing state law, only white male landowners, 6% of the population, could legally vote, leaving 94% of the population, including enslaved African Americans and women, without a say in the laws and policies that affected their daily lives. Since then, to overcome each barrier to enfranchisement, enslavement, property ownership, literacy, race, and sex, has taken years of struggle. By 1856, all states had eliminated property ownership as a voting requirement, for white men only. Women had a long road ahead before they could vote or hold office. Most Americans believed the social order depended upon a separation of gender roles, and women had all the influence they needed by inspiring morality in their husbands. During the first half of the 19th century, within newly forming women's labor associations and the rising anti-slavery crusade, the seeds of women's suffrage sprouted. Abolitionists such as Harriet Tubman and Charlotte Grimke, and labor leaders like Harriet Hanson Robinson led the way. Oh, that I could do much towards bettering our condition. I will do all the very little that lies in my power, while life and strength last. Charlotte Grimke. In 1848, when women were forbidden from speaking in public, some 300 men and women joined organizers Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott in Seneca Falls, New York, for the country's first women's rights convention. They resolved in the Declaration of Sentiments that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure themselves the sacred right to the elective franchise. But African American women were not invited to the event and glaringly omitted from the entire conversation. Many white suffrage leaders feared they would lose the support of influential white Southerners if they advocated for universal suffrage rather than women's suffrage. Author and teacher Frances Ellen Watkins Harper traveled the country lobbying for suffrage movements to include African American women. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Lecturer Matilda Jocelyn Gage championed the way Native American society was more inclusive of women. Labor activists such as Harriet Hanson Robinson began to see the vote as necessary to improving women's working conditions. At the close of the Civil War, the 13th and 14th Amendments abolished slavery and granted African Americans citizenship. Then, in 1869, overextending voting rights to African American men through the 15th Amendment, the women's suffrage movement split. On one side was the National Women's Suffrage Association, opposed to advancing the constitutional rights of African American men before white women. To reinforce its position, this group, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, invoked racialist and nativist rhetoric. On the other side was the American Women's Suffrage Association, supporting the 15th Amendment. Led by women such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Lucy Stone, and Julia Ward Howe, this group pressed for women's rights to vote on a state-by-state basis. While the general population still considered both positions far too radical to be taken seriously, bold women continued to step forward to advance their cause. In 1872, the forward-thinking advocate Victoria Woodhull ran for president at a time it was unimaginable for a woman to hold office. The economic and political prosperity African Americans experienced during Reconstruction came to an abrupt end in 1877. Southern states passed the Jim Crow laws, legalizing literacy tests, poll taxes, violence, and even lynching to curtail the lives and voting rights of the recently emancipated. Few black men voted. Discrimination did not stop with African Americans. English literacy tests in Texas prevented most Mexican American men from voting. Native American men, not recognized as citizens, could vote only by forfeiting tribal associations, applying for naturalization, or serving in the military. And the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese immigrants from citizenship. As the 20th century dawned, a new generation of suffragists and labor union leaders took up the mantle of activism. With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. Ida B. Wells. Wells, a journalist and early crusader for anti-lynching laws, emerged as an outspoken African-American suffragist. Activists like Maria de Guadalupe Evangelina Lopez advocated for women's vote within Spanish-speaking communities. And for indigenous people, outspoken Native Americans, such as Suzette LaFlèche Tibbles and Zeke Kalasha, promoted cultural preservation, citizenship, and voting rights. In working-class immigrant neighborhoods, union leaders such as Rose Schneiderman, Clara Lemlich, and Lucy Parsons viewed the vote as a way to fight for safe working conditions, an 8-hour day, and minimum wage. Ardent believers in civil disobedience, Mabel Lee and Alice Paul organized women's suffrage marches. 10,000 women in New York in 1912 and 5,000 in Washington, D.C. in 1913. At the Washington, D.C. march, when black women were told to line up at the end, Ida B. Wells defiantly stepped into the middle, marching alongside white women. The work was paying off, and by 1918, 21 states allowed women to vote, some in local and some in presidential elections. But without federal protection, state voting rights could be revoked. It was time to demand the constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, languishing in Congress since 1878, be passed. In 1917, suffrage leaders focused their attention on President Woodrow Wilson and in protest took up residency on the doorstep of the White House for almost a year. More than 150 women were arrested, and many, led by Alice Paul, went on hunger strikes to draw public sympathy for the suffrage cause. Finally, in September 1918, Wilson lent his support, and in the spring of 1919, both houses of the U.S. Congress passed the 19th Amendment. By August 1920, the amendment was ratified as part of the U.S. Constitution, and 29 million eligible women voters could no longer be denied the right to vote based on their sex. Yet the struggle was hardly over. Millions of Americans still grappled with barriers to voting. By a miracle, the 19th Amendment has been ratified. We women have now a weapon of defense which we have never possessed before. It will be a shame and reproach to us if we do not use it. However much the white women of the country need suffrage, colored women need it more. Suffragist, educator, and author, Mary Church Terrell. In the 1920s, fewer than 50% of eligible women used their new voting power. Native Americans, granted voting rights in the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, were silenced by voter literacy tests. Many Asian Americans couldn't vote until the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 granted citizenship. In 1921, when African American women appealed to the National Woman Party for support, they were told their disenfranchisement was an issue of race and not gender discrimination. In 1940, a mere 3% of eligible male and female black voters were registered to vote, and in the Jim Crow South, those who tried to register or vote were harassed, beaten, tortured, or lynched. Courageous women fought back. Social activist Mary Church Terrell advocated for a federal anti-lynching law. Community organizers and civil rights leaders like Septima Clark and Fannie Lou Hamer worked tirelessly throughout the South, encouraging voter registration and fighting against voter suppression in the face of escalating violence. Finally, the unspeakably hard work of so many selfless individuals culminated in the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. A few years later, in 1970, Congress additionally prohibited the use of literacy tests as a prerequisite for voting. For the first time in the history of the American Republic, federal oversight was in place, protecting the right to vote of all genders, races, and ethnicities. Voter participation skyrocketed. In 1964 Mississippi, a scant 7% of African Americans were registered to vote. 5 years later, the number was 67%. In California, encouraged by labor activist Dolores Huerta, Latino voter participation increased more than 25% throughout the 1970s. Since 1964, in every presidential election, women's voter participation has outstripped men's. By exercising their right to vote, women have been influencing American life in unprecedented ways. Laws and policies were enacted that advanced gender equality through family leave, birth control, equal pay, credit and banking reforms, abortion rights, and protections against sexual harassment and housing discrimination. Leadership began to look different. More and more women were voted into office. Today, though fewer than 25% of all elected officials are women, seats held by women in the U.S. Congress have gone from 0 prior to 1917 to 127 in 2020. These changes did not go unnoticed. In the final years of the 20th century, conservative strategists worked to counteract the political force of women and voters of color by purging voter lists and manipulating electoral district boundaries, which helped determine the outcome of the presidential election of 2000. Then in 2013's Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court's conservative majority struck down a formula in the 1965 Voting Rights Act that required certain states to submit changes in their voting laws for pre-clearance based on past discrimination. In a much-quoted, memorable dissent, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." Absent a new pre-clearance formula enacted by Congress, some states quickly passed laws that slashed early voting, eliminated same-day registration, closed many polling places, and applied stricter ID requirements. These changes disproportionately suppressed the votes of people of color and women. Voters who may not be able to travel easily to polling places, get paid time off work, or have access to newly required documentation suddenly find themselves unable to vote. It's estimated that 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot currently vote due to restrictive legislation. 1/3 of all women have documents that do not match their current name, and nearly 64% of those turned away from recent elections because of their ID have been women. Despite these alarming setbacks, 2018 saw the largest midterm election turnout of the past century, more than 122 million ballots cast, 53% by women. It was also a record-setting year for people of color and women on the ballot. Almost 600 ran for House, Senate, or governor roles, a nearly 60% increase from the previous election cycle, and some 90 new female lawmakers headed to Washington. Yet with approximately 1,700 mainly Southern polling places closed since 2013 and 36 states now requiring strict voter identification in some form, it is clear that the political voice of women and people of color is once again under attack. Motivated activists, litigators, and civil rights organizations are fighting back, running campaigns combating voter suppression and encouraging voter participation. Voting rights is not an antiquated cause. Rather, it is an ongoing and vital element of American democracy for which we must continue to stand up and speak out.
Hello, my name is Ruth Louie, a member of the BC Voices planning team. You're about to see 2 of the 4 videos comprising the voting rights episode of our Stand Up, Speak Out docuseries. These videos, titled Voting Rights Then and Now, present multi-generational stories by our classmates about how they experienced voting before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and what it means to the current generation. The first is the Soohoo Louie women and discusses what it was like for her Chinese family to immigrate to the US and become US citizens, and how they got the right to vote then, and what their legacy means to Lily and her children now. The second video, the Louie women, features 2 members of my Black American family, my grandniece and her great aunt, Murtis. Murtis and I were born and raised in the Jim Crow era South, where we lived until our individual departures for Chicago and New York, seeking greater opportunity. We talk about what we and our parents experienced before and after the Voting Rights Act. And my grandniece, Eva, only learned our stories and what they meant during the taped interview. I ask you to please visit our website, standoutspeakout.org, to view the 3rd and 4th episodes in the voting rights episode of the docuseries, which features our classmates, Catherine Cretu and Andrea Polk Stevenson. Both provide different multi-generational views of women's right to vote through their mothers, daughters, and granddaughters. BC Voices thanks you for joining us this afternoon, for allowing us to tell our stories about the impact of voting on our lives by standing up and speaking out in these videos. Let's watch.
I was born in 1949 in Baltimore, Maryland. People came in under paper documents. They pretended to be someone's son. My father came in 1930 when he was 15 because his father was here before then and he had to come before he was 16, otherwise he couldn't come as a child. At that time, women were not allowed in the United States to immigrate. His mother couldn't come along, and so he came reluctantly, but that was the chance that he had. My mother actually had gone to a missionary college in China, and I think she reluctantly got married because it was a match. They got married in around 1942, and she couldn't come till 1948 because women were not allowed to immigrate till after the war. If you did serve in the war, GIs, no matter what the reason, they were permitted to become naturalized.
I've always known how much my parents, my grandparents, and all the generations going back have worked so hard to come here and how much they sacrificed in order to have me live the way I live.
My parents did not vote. I think they didn't care to vote. I think they didn't feel that they had a voice, even if they could vote. In the Chinese community, most people didn't vote. There was an intimidation about voting because they felt if they were not regularized in terms of being legal and documented, they could cause attention to the fact that they were. They felt that, well, we might cause trouble for the other people in our family if we voted. They opened up this opportunity for people to regularize by the confession. Not until the 60s or late 50s would people start feeling that they could register to vote and to feel that they had some backbone of legal support. Well, I remember that my mother was working in a garment factory. She didn't get enthusiastic about voting until Kennedy ran for office. And I think suddenly people said, well, Kennedy's from an Irish family, that's an immigrant family. My mother was getting enthusiastic about registering to vote and voting for Kennedy. And then my father felt a little competitive and finally said, well, I should register to vote, and I too will have a voice. I don't think people wanted to run for political office. That would bring too much attention on yourself. I mean, until Hawaii became a state, I don't think any Asian wanted to really run for office. You just did not want that much attention.
I didn't realize how much there was to overcome and struggle through. I think I'm very lucky to be living in a place where I feel like I can have the freedom to say and express how I feel.
The civil rights movement brought a perspective that this was not an impossibility. If Blacks could have a voice and immigrants can have a voice and the diverse voices can be heard, the fact that education opened up for many people from diverse groups happened because of the civil rights movement. Working on Capitol Hill just gave me a much more practical perspective. You realize that it is a major goal to make any substantial legislation. It takes years. I just realized that you did have to do everything in steps.
I hope that this future election kind of really brings people together. I signed up to be a poll worker and I've been, writing letters and postcards. I've never really been that politically involved before.
I'm proud of the fact my daughters get involved without fear. I'm optimistic in terms of the fact that the younger generation is participating.
I'm really proud of my mom and all of the powerful women who have come before me, have really fought for the rights that we have.
I grew up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, for most of my first 18 years. This is the rural South. Jim Crow still existed. We had restrictions on where we could go to the bathroom, where we could drink water, things like that. Here's my recollection about Black people trying to vote in Tuscaloosa at that time. It was difficult. It was difficult and a lot of them were turned away. Even then, they were trying to put up barriers related to having some kind of ID. A lot of them didn't even drive, let alone have some kind of ID that they could produce. Separate but equal did not mean equal.
My father told me of his experience of trying to register to vote in Canton, Mississippi. And down there, all Black people who had any hopes of voting had to pay what was called a poll tax of $2 a year. My father paid his poll tax. He went down to register to vote, and they asked him a lot of silly, I call unanswerable questions. How many kernels of corn is on a corn cob? Something like that. Stupid stuff. And he didn't pass that, so he was never able to register to vote. And I don't know of any of my family members who ever voted. Voting was never discussed in my family. We didn't talk about it, we didn't think about it. because we knew that we couldn't be involved in it. And when I became of age and I was working, I was teaching. Teachers were told that if they made an attempt to vote, they would lose their jobs. So I never tried.
When I think about what my aunt and my relatives went through, it's kind of eye-opening because this happened just a few years ago, not even hundreds and hundreds of years like I would imagine to happen. And it's kind of eye-opening how now, just a few years later, I'm having all these opportunities and I'm able to do this, which they would have had backlash for.
My mom, Clara, she wanted to get registered to vote. And I think the literacy test may have tripped her up some. And that whole experience inspired her to go back to school and get her high school diploma. And I don't think she missed one after that. She voted regularly.
When I hear about my aunt's experience trying to get the right to vote, I'm really inspired. People were fighting for it. People were dying for it. They were dying for us and my generation to be able to speak our opinion. We were given this, so we should use it.
When I moved to Chicago, it was a feeling of relief that I could take part in the election process, never having done it before in my life. But I was totally happy that I was able to exercise my right to vote. Very, very happy. And I've been voting ever since, every year.
It was a big victory for Black people. I remember distinctly one of the things that I saw happen after more Black people got the vote, that the street that I lived on was paved. It was not before. In fact, the street would stop where the white neighborhood started. The street would change from paved to unpaved. And finally, enough votes from Black people in the community who registered to vote meant that they got, a paved street. I could see actual change.
Voting gives me a voice and a chance to speak my opinion and to hopefully get my voice heard. It's really inspiring and it makes me feel like I can make some good change too.
I'm hopeful about the America that Eva and her generation are inheriting. And I'm hopeful about it because of people like Eva.
I think a lot of people want to vote and are excited to vote. It's kind of like it's uncool not to vote now.
Oh, that's very encouraging. Yeah, Eva.
I'm glad to see any young person who is exerting that effort. That makes me real proud.
This is a right we shouldn't have to fight for. We really shouldn't.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Shapiro Metz, class of 1971, with an update on the current status of voting rights. The right to vote is suffering from death by 1,000 cuts. At last count, more than 400 laws in 47 states are rolling back the improvements that made it possible for so many people to vote in 2020 and throwing in a few new obstacles for good measure. At the same time, there are twice as many laws at the state level to improve voting rights. We will see where things stand as the state legislatures start closing their sessions for the summer. You can find details online at the Brennan Center for Justice and Democracy Docket. You will see those websites in the chat. They will get updated periodically. I'll just give a few examples of voting restrictions in state laws, either proposed or passed, that particularly affect women. Strict exact match voter ID. Many women change their names when they get married or divorced, and they don't think about changing their voter registration at the same time. They can be purged from voter rolls without even being notified. Their ballots can be thrown away without being notified and without a chance to file an appeal. They can be rejected when they sign in at the polling place and not allowed to submit a provisional ballot. Cutting back and cutting out mail-in ballots, drop-off boxes, and early voting. Many women work in service jobs with constantly changing shifts. Their employers don't have to give them time off to vote in person. If they're absent from work, they can't get paid and they can get fired. Closing polling places and reducing voting hours. Many women are full-time caregivers for small children and disabled adults. They have to bring babies in strollers and grandparents in wheelchairs along with them when they go to vote. They're likely to give up on voting when they know they're up against long trips and long lines just to get inside. All this could be preempted at the federal level by the For the People Act. It already passed the House twice, known as H.R. 1. Now it's sitting in the Senate, known as S1, waiting to be scheduled for a vote, maybe heading for a filibuster. There's a fallback plan, the John Lewis Act, which at least would bring back the federal pre-clearance law that would require federal review of election laws in states that have a long, long history of voter suppression. What will happen next? I don't know. But I do know that your vote and your voice can make a difference.
Thank you, Susan, for that update on how a fundamental right of our democracy, voting rights, is once again under attack. Now, it's going to be your turn to share your stories about the importance of the right to vote in your personal lives. So in this virtual environment, here's how we're going to do this. You're going to have 30 minutes to share in small groups of fellow alumni via breakout rooms. Each person will have about 90 seconds and possibly a little bit more to share a personal experience. Then we'll return to the big group for a wrap up lasting about 10 minutes, during which a spokesperson from each of the small groups will share key awarenesses and insights from the small group discussions. I hope you enjoyed your sharing. I know that the groups are they were a lot smaller, and I hope intimate. You had some intimate conversations about the right to vote. So we're in the time, we're only going to have about 10 minutes to share, unfortunately, hear from the small groups. I'm going to put on my timer. So what I'd like to do is to have the spokesperson from each group. Andrea, you need to put yourself on mute if you're talking to somebody. Great. So what I'd like to, is to have the spokespeople put your name in first and last name in the chat. And I am then just going to have to call on people randomly. I'm sorry, we're not going to have time for everybody to share. So Cheryl, you want to start? Well, yeah, Cheryl, why don't you start?
The thing that was surprising was the way that there are so many layers within our history that impact our voting. And one of the standouts was one of our people is a professor and offered credit to her students if they would encourage 5 relatives or friends to vote. And I thought that was a remarkable experience. And we discovered that we have different experiences from living in different parts of the country. and the way that voting can affect us, not just nationally, but locally, can change dramatically with laws that come into being.
Right. Great. Cheryl, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to Free. I'm afraid I'm going to mispronounce your last name.
Mondesir. Yeah, Mondesir. That's okay. It's close.
Okay, great. Good. All right, you're on. You got about 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. I am Free Mondesir from the class of 2003, and I have some notes. So I had, it was four of us total, and one student is from class of 2022, and so she's been voting for 3 years, and it was very exciting to hear that. And so her mom was the driving factor. It wasn't as important when her mom was, I guess, eligible with voting, but then she changed, and so now she's the rally for her mom's sister, and we shared that as a common experience that we try to support each other. Even if we don't have issues, all four of us said we didn't have any issues, we can just go vote. So we really appreciate that we have this, and if we lived in certain areas, even now, we know that we would probably still have an issue. One person there they live in Arizona, and there's an indigenous population there, and there are some problems with them, and so they could vote. So, so that was interesting to hear. Yeah, so we said the work continues, and we appreciate that we can continue rallying friends, family, and we know that it's really, really important because, as one person said in our group, we wouldn't have this opportunity, especially as women, over 100 years ago. So it's really important that we have it. So anyone who doesn't have it now, it's just terrible, and they should not have that. And we appreciate the site, which I guess I'll put in the chat, to standupspeakout.org. And we appreciate that all the work that everyone is doing so that we can all vote. Thank you.
Yeah, and I also just want to remind us, you mentioned that we didn't have the right to vote 100 years ago. The other thing that came up in our group, and we tried to say in the film, is that actually it wasn't until 1965 that every woman in the country had a right to vote. And we think of it as 1920, but really it was 1965. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Sarai, you're up for 2 minutes. Sarai Crane.
Sorry. Okay. So our group had 3 people, and we had similar experiences. We all live in New York City, and we all grew up in New York State. And we realized that we grew up somewhat in a bubble because we weren't challenged to vote. We were taught to vote in school. I talked about when I was a Girl Scout, and we used to go babysit. We used to go to the polls and watch people come in. And then as moms would come and bring their kids, we'd watch the kids for them so they could vote. And in junior high, they'd bring in real polling machines when we elected our representatives for student government, so we would know how to vote. So we were taught to vote. All 3 of us are very committed to voting, and we're somewhat infuriated or outraged by what we saw today. And we spent a lot of time discussing the attempts now to suppress voting. And what does that mean? And how people talk about it, but they don't talk about what the agenda is. And that the agenda is to limit democracy. And how can that possibly be in the 21st century? And that the right to vote is powerful, that it makes you a player, it makes you part of the system, and that it's something we really truly believe in, and believe that everybody should have that opportunity, and that we're obligated to really fight these laws and to make sure that everybody has the right to vote. That for those of us who did it our whole lives, the notion that people have ever been limited is outrageous, that we just don't understand it, and feel committed to helping to enable people to always have those rights and to stop the legislation.
Right. Thank you, Sarai. Thank you. Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. Great. Perfect. All right, Brianna Brown.
Hello. I was in a group with 3 other people. They were very lovely. Oh, can you all hear me?
We can hear you. Maya, can you put her on spotlight? Brianna Brown?
Brianna, do you want to turn your...
There we go. Oh, no, that's you, Maya. Brianna, you have to turn on your video.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry about that. So I was in a group with 3 other people, and my experience is obviously very different than theirs, as I'm someone who's about to graduate in the next 3 years, and they graduated so long before me. And we talked about like the differences and how some of us had grown up in a bubble where voting was very normalized and it was a thing that everyone around them did. And one woman shared her experience on the way in which how growing up in Alabama, there were so many restrictions and so many barriers to vote in. And in my experience personally, as a first generation Jamaican American, I saw my mom's experience with voting. She immigrated here 20 years ago, but only got her citizenship about like 5 or 7 years ago. And so our first time voting together was in the 2016 election. As you can imagine, that was like very important. And I think that personally, I don't know how important voting is to me. I think that I'm very privileged in the fact that I don't have any barriers to voting, and all I have to do is register and just go and send in an absentee ballot. But because the people that I'm voting for never truly have my best interest at heart, or never will truly be advocating for me and for my communities, I find it very hard to like appreciate that. Understanding my privilege, I still find it very hard to appreciate what it means to vote and like how important and how significant it is for others. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brianna. Thank you very much. All right, Linda, can you do it? Linda Zapula, and you've got like 1 minute. Can you give us a 1 minute synopsis of your group?
Yes, it was a small group, as I think they all were. And the conversation really talked about the fact that the right to vote may have been taken for granted, but it's become much more visible now. And so the importance of voting has gained a lot of visibility. And one in our group said, you can tell how important it is by how hard they are trying to remove the voting right from some of our communities in the country. And so, you know, it's a little sad and frustrating to see something that we thought battles had been fought now have to be fought again. So that's all.
Right, great, good. Thank you, Linda. Thank you. And thank you all for engaging in the conversation. And I wish we had time to hear from others, and unfortunately we're not. But if you want to write in the chat, the spokesperson, write in the chat, what was the what were the things you would have shared. And Maya, are we going to be able to save the chat and then we could collect those comments at a different
Yes, we can.
And find a way to, perfect, great, that would be great, good. So thank you all so very much. And we're now going to hear from Lee Canosa, who's going to share with us what you can do.
Oh, thank you. It's been a really wonderful event. I'm so glad you were all able to make it. I'm the class of 71, and I've been pleased to be involved in the BC Voices oral history project through the mini docs and the docuseries, part of which you just saw. Please be aware that we're just midway through our intentioned full output. We have 2 on the books, well, 2 in the planning stages. The next one is going to be on reproductive rights, and we hope that anyone who has any input for us will contact us through bcvoicesinc@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. Needless to say, this is a wide and very important topic. Again, also with these rights under siege right now. We also want to thank our sponsors, some very generous donors, as well as the many, many donors who were able to give only small amounts at all counts. We have a bare bones operation, and it does take a good bit of money, and it costs per minute to put these things on, and to do it in such a really wonderful way with all our academic support that we have gotten as well. You know, I think people were informed by the presentation, enlightened, disturbed, and motivated. And I look forward to hearing comments directly through BC Voices or however. Again, we thank you and look forward to hearing more from you. I think we're gonna take it to Carla at this point. Hi.
Just a moment, I have to get out of chat. Hi, I'm Carla Spurlock Evans. I'm a member of the class of 1971 and an enduring supporter of BC Voices Incorporated. As we come to the end of this opportunity to share our testimonies regarding voting, I offer you encouraging words from Carrie Chapman Catt, a leader in the struggle for the right to vote for American women. Founder of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance in 1904 and two-term president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Catt founded the League of Women Voters in 1920, 6 months before her decades-long mobilizing efforts culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Chapman Catt's legacy is not without controversy. Alongside other white suffragists of her time, she struggled with how to build a national movement for universal suffrage in the face of fierce resistance from women who opposed voting rights for all, some of whom feared the growing influence of new immigrants, and others, largely from the South and Southwest, who feared that the votes of Black and Brown women, when added to the votes of Black and Brown men, assuredly would pose a formidable threat to white supremacy. Despite her earlier equivocation, in 1917, Chapman Catt led the executive board of the National American Women's Suffrage Association to pass a resolution setting forth, quote, its belief in and its stand for the broad type of American democracy that knows no bias on the grounds of race, color, creed, or sex, to the end that Americans may stand united, one and all as Americans for American, end quote, end of quote. Carrie Chapman Catt exhorted, the vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you never can comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling to you to make no pause. Act. I was supposed to raise my fist when I said act. Thank you all for sharing your insights and being with us today. We hope you will join us for more Reunion Reimagined events. Please visit reunion.barnard.edu to learn about upcoming programs.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you all in one for being here for discussions about voting in our life and its importance.